No matter how urgently you see the issue of climate change, this might have been a scary week for you. Canadians woke up on April 1st, no less, to a warning from federal scientists. This country is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Turns out, being a northern country, no joke. But also, in 4 provinces, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick, the federal government imposed a carbon tax.
I'm not happy. We already pay too much.
I feel like I feel it every time I need to fill up my car anyway.
Gas in those provinces went up on average 4.5 cents per liter. So no matter how you slice it, the reality of climate change is hitting just a little harder than it used to, which makes us ask, is this a turning point? And what is the path forward anyway? To help us answer some of those questions, 3 people who know an awful lot about the subject. Blair Feltmate joining us, head of the Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. We've got Catherine Abreu, Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, and Mark Cameron is Executive Director of Canadians for Clean Prosperity and a former Policy Director in Stephen Harper's government. So thanks to the 3 of you for joining us. And Catherine, I'll start with you just on that really basic question, right, of whether we are indeed at a turning point in terms of how urgently Canadians see the issue of climate change.
Yeah, great question. I think 2018 was a turning point in a number of ways. Number one, we had that really pivotal report from the world scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in October of 2018 that solidified the science and I think sent a resounding message around the world. And we see that Canadians do accept the science of climate change. They believe it's real. Right. We have also seen just this past week, as you've mentioned, the report on climate change in Canada. So Canadians who may otherwise have been thinking climate change is something that happens in some other parts of the world are seeing it's real here in Canada.
Totally fair. I mean, but there is still a PR battle ahead, right? And I mean, you just look at the inertia to overcome this notion that I think a lot of people maybe legitimately have that we're just kind of along for the ride, right? That Canada, you look at the sum total of this country's emissions compared to, China, the US, Russia, India, Japan, we're down at the bottom of the list. I mean, how do you reconcile that?
Well, I don't think Canada is actually that small. We're about the 10th largest emitter in the world, and we're the #1 emitter among the OECD countries in per capita emissions. But the fact that Canada is relatively small doesn't mean that we don't have a role to play. We send troops to Afghanistan, even though on our own we could never bring about peace in Afghanistan. We send $10 or $15 billion a year in aid to Africa, even though we know that we can't on our own solve international development. So we have a global responsibility, and we have to take that responsibility internationally.
That responsibility being to lead by example?
Sure. There's no way that developing countries like China or India, Indonesia, Brazil are going to act if they don't see developed countries like Canada acting in first or at least at the same time.
Climate change is irreversible. It is here to stay. We're not going backwards. Climate change has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen. However, relative to emissions of greenhouse gases, we should do everything we can to slow down the rate of emissions, to slow down the rate of change. But then we also have to recognize that extremes in weather relative to flooding, fire, drought, hail, wherever you may be in the country, that is going to be the reality going forward, that those challenges are going to become more and more dire or challenging, and we have to step up in terms of adapting to these extreme weather events, and we need to do so rapidly. Right.
Mark, you come at this from a unique perspective, because as I mentioned in the introduction, I mean, you were senior policy advisor to Stephen Harper. What was it like trying to get climate issues on the front burner, and particularly in a government context? Because, again, just for context, I mean, Stephen Harper was a guy who wasn't exactly a fan of the Kyoto Protocol.
Well, the previous government didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol. However, the government did have a commitment to climate change at both Copenhagen and Paris. The 30% reduction target were the targets that Stephen Harper introduced. Minister Jim Prentice and John Baird had the Turning the Corner plan, which was actually quite dramatic. It called for a $60 a ton carbon price by 2020. So there was interest in the issue. It just unfortunately didn't go far enough, and we've seen many, 2 steps forward, 1 step back on this issue.
And there are always competing issues, though, right? And so I just wonder, was there a sense of frustration in the sense that you always want to do more, but those competing interests can get in the way?
Sure. The global financial crisis in 2008 really set back progress on climate change for a number of years, and now the cycle has come around again, and climate change is back on the front burner.
Carbon tax.
It's one way forward. As I mentioned before, it's been imposed on 4 provinces most recently. Is it an effective way of tackling climate change, Kathy?
Yes, carbon pricing works, but it can't work alone. And that's why the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth lays out over 50 policies that work together to address climate change, help with adaptation, and to grow our clean economy.
But for those holdout provinces, though, who believe that there ought to be a different way, right? And again, to reiterate, Ontario, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, on who those carbon taxes were most recently imposed, I mean, their point of view would simply be that you know, we could perhaps tackle pollution at the source, right, in terms of developing cleaner sources of energy as opposed to taxing people, say, at the gas pumps. Is there virtue in that approach?
I think so. I would not dismiss it. In other words, when you talk to those governments, they may not be big fans of a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, but I don't hear any of them saying that that we don't believe that climate change is real and that we shouldn't work to reduce emissions. Right. They simply believe that there may be a better and or different mechanism to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that economists will tell you that a carbon tax is the least cost, most effective way of reducing carbon emissions. And if you're not going to do a carbon price, and there are alternatives, you can do regulation, there are other ways of dealing with it, but you have to lay out what your alternative is and what the costs are, because there are costs of regulation just as much as there's a cost to a carbon price. And the fact is, nobody likes a tax that's visible, whether it's the HST or a tax at the gas pumps. But if you don't have visible tax, you're going to have hidden costs that are buried throughout the economy.
You said something interesting there, that economists like the idea as an effective way of dealing with the environment. Do environmentalists and ecologists see the idea as being a particularly effective one? I mean, that's a question I posed to you earlier. I also wonder if there are other alternatives, other better ways.
We have plenty of evidence to show us that carbon pricing can work to drive down emissions. It doesn't hamstring the economy. It actually works to ensure that we're incorporating the costs of pollution, because right now pollution's free. But it is absolutely the case that there are a variety of other ways to achieve those goals. We're unfortunately in a situation in Canada right now where the conversation around climate change has become highly partisanized and highly polarized. Climate change is not a partisan issue. It might be a political issue, but it is not a partisan one. And we have a long history of various governments of different political identities in Canada offering great solutions. So yes, there's a variety of ways to do it, but we have to make sure that everyone has a plan.
But there's another part to climate change that we haven't talked about, and that's adaptation to climate change.
Right.
And when you go right across the country, I have not met a premier that wasn't on board in reference to adapting to climate change, to putting measures in place to lessen the risks associated with flooding that is getting worse or forest fires that are problematic. They're all on board on deploying best practices to take risk out of the system or anticipate that risk and prepare.
What are the examples we should be looking to in terms of smart ways of adapting to the reality that climate is changing?
In my opinion, I would hit the one that's most costly to Canadians right now, and that is treatable, practically and cost effectively, and that is flooding and flooding basements. That's the #1 cost in the country as of this moment. And there are things people can do around their house on a weekend for a few $100s that will be the difference in most cases between having perhaps a $40,000 or $50,000 basement flood or not. And it's as simple as, for example, things like disconnecting the downspout from the eaves trough system. If that goes into the ground, cut it off, put an elbow on direct water 3 meters from the foundation. Plastic covers over window wells so the water doesn't fill the window well, go into the basement. Check your sub pump to make sure it works, that it's not seized, and so that when the water hits, it will pump the water out of the basement. It's ready to work. A few things like that around a house can be the difference between having a major flood in your basement versus not. That is highly doable, and we should operationalize that as top priority.
In terms of conveying the message that this is an urgent issue that is worthy of our attention and immediate action, I mean, what would you say?
So I think Canadians are experiencing the impacts of climate change firsthand. The report that we had this week told us Canadian communities are experiencing floods, fires, melting of permafrost, as bad as many other communities in other parts of the world. From my perspective, the call to arms is really about talking to our elected officials, having a conversation about climate change, and pointing out that regardless of one's political identity, we experience the impacts of climate change, and we have the conviction that it's necessary for us to take action.
Two things. There's been a lot of talk over the last week, especially about the costs of carbon pricing. Not nearly enough focus on the benefits. Every Canadian is going, or at least in those 4 provinces, are going to be getting rebates this spring that for most households will be more than what they will actually pay in the carbon tax. And we have to focus on the fact that that revenue is not lost. That revenue goes back to the economy, back to households. Average household in Ontario getting $307, and in Saskatchewan about double that. Secondly, what this report has showed is that climate change is not something for the far-off future. It's not something that's going to only take place in Bangladesh or the Maldives. It's taking place in Canada. It's taking place now, and we have to act now.
It's a little bit like this. You're heading down the road in a little compact car in a certain direction at a certain speed. But you look in your rear view mirror and you see a giant transport truck coming up right behind you, but at twice your speed. Moving in the right direction isn't good enough. You got to speed up. And that's what we have to do in Canada. That's the biggest mistake we're making right now, is not moving fast enough. We're going in the right direction, but we got to go faster.
Blair, Mark, Catherine, wonderful chat. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.